Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Stephen Jurd. I'm here at the Sydney Retreat. I give a series of talks about addiction and the brain. It takes people from the doctor's opinion in 1938 through to this doctor's opinion in 2022. I do 4 sessions. The first one is the reward pathway, and now I'm moving on to genetics. Dr. Silkworth was very keen on stressing to new patients of his, and many of his patients ended up as the early members of AA. Dr. Silkworth was keen on stressing that not only was alcoholism a mental illness, it was also a physical illness. And people understood it to be a deficiency of will, of moral fibre, of decision making, but they didn't understand that there might be something physical. And Silkworth is among the first people to say there's definitely something physical wrong. As we talked about in the last session, it has been discovered since then that there's a specific part of the brain that explains a number of the anomalies around addiction. So if it's physical and if it's in our bodies, shouldn't there be something genetic? That's not necessarily the case, but if there's something genetic, it'd point us back to the body, certainly. Are there any alcoholics in the room? Yes, there are, okay. You might have heard addiction runs in families, and certainly there's ample casual community understanding of that. But how do we know whether it's nature or nurture? How do we know that it's the environment in which people are raised and they're just copying mum and dad, or whether it's actually in their DNA? Can you imagine an experiment that you could do to distinguish those two things, to distinguish the nature from the nurture, to separate them? How would you do that? And so let's talk about twin studies. The first thing you have to do with twin studies is distinguish between the 2 types of twins. So there's 2 types of twins. There's identical and fraternal. So that is, the fraternal ones are just like brother and sister, or for the purposes of the twin studies, it's always brother and brother or sister and sister. Twins, fraternal twins are just as likely to be same sex as opposite sex, but they do same sex because then they're more likely to have had exactly the same environment. If you've got opposite sex twins, well then you can help yourself to distinguish them by always putting the girl in pink and the boy in blue, or whatever stereotype you want to put on it, and that helps you to know where you are with your twins. If your fraternal twins are same sex, well then they end up with pretty much identical environments. Okay, and so then you compare your fraternals with your identicals. And so the identical twins, raised in the same family at the same time, not only have the same environment, but they also have the same genetics. So you've all seen the ovum under the microscope, surrounded by thousands of wigglers, all saying, let me in, let me in, let me in, let me in, I want to make a baby. The sperm is trying to say, I want to go in. First thing to note is that the sperm's so much smaller than the ovum. So the ovum contains all the cytoplasm, all of the mitochondria, all of the endoplasmic reticulum, all the little subcellular particles that are all the organelles inside the cell. You get all of them from your mum, and you only get DNA from your dad. That's all the sperm is. It's a tiny little thing that's out there. It's just a wiggler on the end to make it swim, and then a lump of DNA. 23 chromosomes. And then the big cell blinks and says, you can come in. Only one comes in. Swims in, goes all the way to the nucleus and finds half of mum's chromosomes. And together, those 23 plus the other 23 make 46. And that's how a new human is made, with 46 chromosomes. All right, and then we've got the very beginning of a new human being here, and then it divides and you get 2 cells. And then they divide to 4 and 8 and 16. For identical twins to happen, somewhere in that very early phase, they divide and split so that they've come from exactly the same sperm and egg. So they've got exactly the same DNA. You know identical twins? You've met identical twins? They're hard to tell apart, aren't they? They've got the same DNA. They share 100% of DNA. Whereas fraternal share 50%. They're just like 2 brothers, 2 sisters. You've seen brothers, you've seen sisters. Sometimes they're very much alike, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they have the same tendency, their voice sounds the same, they tell jokes in the same way. It's like, oh, it's a bit weird. But they share a lot, they share 50% of their DNA. So, the way you do the twin study is you compare the match rate. What's the match? If one has alcoholism, does the other have alcoholism? And for fraternal twins, it comes out about 50%. They share 50% of their DNA, they share exactly the same environment. If one's got it, there's a 50-50 chance that the other one will. That's pretty high. The rate of alcoholism in the general community isn't 50%, is it? The match rate for the identical twins, you wouldn't expect it to be 100%. It's 80. So a significantly higher concordance rate is what they call it in the literature for identical than for fraternal twins. So if you've got the same DNA, it's a 4 out of 5 chance that you're going to match your identical twin sibling, whether they're alcoholic or not. So that says, it's genetic. And Silkworth would be impressed. Yes? Absolutely. Talking about there's something physical. Because, wait on. So I talked about, we go from here to the swimmer goes into the nucleus, and then every other cell created from that single cell has the identical DNA. It's in your eyelashes. It's in the skin on the palms of your hands. It's in your heart. Of course, it's in your brain. It's everywhere. So you see where we're going with this? We're talking to new people who are just in recovery, who are looking at, have I got this thing? And what's the exception? Maybe I can run from it. Maybe I can hide from it. Not from your DNA. Not from your DNA, you can't. And some people are much more likely than others to develop alcoholism. Okay, so that's twin studies. Let's go to adoption studies. Some smart American worked it out. The smart American worked out that the Swedes were really organised. The Swedish people have adoption registers and they've got alcoholism registers, and you can match them up. So the smart American did all the high-level diplomacy to be able to get access to the de-identified data and do all that matching and see how it came out. To fully understand this data, you need to think about adoption. Typically, how old are the parents of adopted kids? The biological parents?
Oh, young. Very young.
Yeah, young, oftentimes teenagers. So these parents of these adopted children, the biological parents of the adopted children, have mostly not got a diagnosis of alcoholism yet because they're too young. They're just a bit wild. Some of you might remember that phase. So it's sort of almost, and for an emergent alcoholic, it's quite easy to disappear into the wallpaper of the crazy party, and you just have to find the party crazy enough and you're indistinguishable from the other people. And so then, one night stand or teenage love affair, baby's adopted out, baby is adopted into, the best family that the adoption agency can find. They can't control all variables. Maybe it's not a great family, who knows? But they've made an effort. So what you do in an adoption study is, before we were matching or comparing identical to fraternal, now you're matching up alcoholic parents, biological parents, with the outcome in the adoptees. And comparing the rates in the adoptees who are what they always call family history positive and family history negative, who are biological family history positive. Now, it's the first study they did was only in males. Alcoholism is becoming more common in females, but it's still not even up to 50-50. Generations ago, it was 2-1, it was even 3-1. So they thought, oh, if we're going to find this, let's just do fathers and sons. Let's just see if the father, the biological father, is an alcoholic, what is the chance of an adopted son who's never met, who's only got those 23 chromosomes. Remember, great big ovum, tiny little sperm, that little package of genetic information going into this new human being. What's the chance that that could affect a behavioural outcome, a drinking outcome, 30 years later in that child? Doesn't seem sensible, really, does it? It doesn't seem plausible until you understand the power of DNA. It encodes every protein that's in our body. So when the body wants to make proteins, it lines the amino acids up against DNA, and the amino acids create a protein. So every protein that's in our body, our muscles, our fibres, the protein in our brain cells, all of that is all made on a template, the design created by our DNA. And every single cell has the information that could create a whole new being, so that we cloned Dolly the sheep. A long time ago now, isn't it? But you can clone an animal from a single cell because all the information's in the DNA. So that tiny little packet of DNA, the fathers, it has been done subsequently with mothers too. This first study I'm talking about is the biological fathers and the family history positive sons. What they found out, there was a 4 times increased chance of alcoholism in this group over that group. Right? So say there's 100 in this group and 1,000 in that group. There's 50 alcoholics in that group and only 120 in that because it's out of 1,000. 12% versus 50%. So the biological sons of alcoholic fathers, as demonstrated, again, mostly subsequently, they've got into the register for alcoholism in Sweden. And the chances that their sons would be after that in the register themselves was increased times 4, just from that little packet of DNA. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? So that goes with the twin studies, and that says, wow, that's amazing. There's something there. Oh, and by the way, that study's been replicated multiple times. Or the twin study's been replicated with an Australian sample. So I'm quoting the studies I know best, but there are multiple other studies as well. So this is not just like a flash in the pan. What's another way that you could look at genetics in families? If you perhaps followed them for generations and you did a long-term follow-up, you might find, how does it divide up? Because not all the kids from the family are going to end up alcoholic. What about the kids of the non-alcoholics? They, if it's genetic, they should have a higher risk. If they come from a heavily alcoholic family, but they're not alcoholics themselves. They can't, they've got some alcoholic genes that passed on. Yeah, okay. What about that? So, in a long-term follow-up study, and this is a little bit more difficult to understand. We'll have to go through this carefully. So George Valiant, Harvard professor, got access to long-term follow-up studies, like 40, 50 years of following people from being adolescents through to late middle age. And they follow these people and they've interviewed them and they've interviewed their family and they assess their family very closely on the way in. What he decided to do was to float the hypothesis that perhaps you're more likely to have alcoholism if you've got more relatives that have alcoholism. And that's exactly what he found. So he found an increase in the rate of alcoholism that was dependent upon the number of alcoholics in the family. Whether you lived with them or not. So the 14-year-old boy whose father had fled and he was from a single parent family, who'd never lived with his alcoholic family, his alcoholic father, but they knew they had lots of alcoholic uncles as well. He was more likely to become alcoholic than the only alcoholic in his family was his stepfather. So though they lived with an alcoholic, but he wasn't biologically related to him, no increased chance. So they found very clearly that the more alcoholics in your family, the more likely you were to become alcoholic, whether or not you lived with them. Which is not to say that living with an alcoholic is a good thing or protective, but in that particular study, the main problem of living with an alcoholic was that you were biologically related to them and that you shared their DNA. And so now most good authors say that it's somewhere like 50 to 60% of the outcome for alcoholism is associated with genetics. And interestingly, as they study more, they're finding genetic connections for other addictions as well. A paper I just read recently said the genetic link was even stronger for heroin addiction. Who would have thought? Certainly that's not the way it's sold, is it? And so that's why this is really important. This is really important because this is Dr. Silkworth's best fantasy, to say there is something that's actually physically different. Now, it's not like an on-off switch. It's not like, I don't know, can I get under the light? Show my hair used to be red, okay? It's faded with age, as so many things do. And so I was already interested in genetics as a little child, right? Because I was one of 8 children. I was the only ginger amongst the bunch. It's like, how did that happen? So I was interested and studied up on Mendelian genetics, that single gene. Hair colour and eye colour are a bit like that, so brown's dominant, blue's recessive. 2 brown-eyed people can have a blue-eyed child if they've got one dominant and one recessive, and the 2 recessives come together, make a blue-eyed child sort of thing. And red hair's recessive. And that's why it's not remarkable, that my dad had one red-haired gene and my mum had one red-haired gene. Her great-grandfather was a redhead. My father's father was a redhead, and so the recessive gene came down and they came together on average it'd be 2 out of 8. The fact that it's 1 out of 8, no big deal. Just the way the dice rolls, and I was the only ginger. Okay, I talk about this to say genetics for addiction are not like that. They're much more complicated. It's not one gene, it's multiple genes. In fact, there are good studies that implicate 4 separate genes already, 4 specific genes. They're saying this gene increases your chance. But as to a single gene determining your outcome, not so much. Each of them only move the needle a little bit, and they probably interact with one another, and risk factor gene number 1 really fires up with gene number 31, but 31 doesn't fire up without 1, or whatever, if you see what I'm saying. So these things can, so it's a polygenic condition, multiple genes. And these 3 different strands, these 3 different strands of science, 3 different types of studies, however, all point to the same thing. And so for a serious drinker, somebody who's thinking, am I an alcoholic? Sometimes this can be really helpful to say, oh yeah, I don't want to say I'm an alcoholic because I hated my dad who was an alcoholic. And go, well, did you know that actually increases your risk? And for serious drinkers, and as we've established there are some in this room, it might help you to accept that the only reasonable thing to do under these circumstances is to say, I'm a little bit different. As a redhead, I'm a little bit different. I could wear fake tan. It won't stop me from burning. My dermatologist laughs at me. He says, oh yes, so you get burnt in 10 or 15 minutes? He's like, yeah. He says, oh, okay. And then it goes red and sometimes it blisters? Yeah. He says, and then it just goes white again? You don't tan? Yes, that's right. Oh, yeah, good. I call this type A. And so what's the solution for that? The solution for that isn't fake tan. It isn't pretending. It isn't having stronger willpower. Oh, this time I'll go in the sun and I won't burn. Okay? It's stay out of the sun, wear sunblock. Adjust, Steve, to your genetics. That's what I have to do. I have to accept and adapt. 2 A's. I have to think about how I change my life. And so people who've got this genetic proclivity that's already been manifest can step back and look at themselves and go, well, I got 4 uncles who died early because of alcoholism, and here I am in a rehab. What does that mean about my future? Okay, and you don't have to be Albert Einstein to work it out. And so it takes you to the question that's asked in the AA Big Book, am I bodily and mentally different from my fellows? And if you are, then it becomes a very reasonable decision to abstain. Now that's why this stuff was really important for Silkworth back in 1938. And that's why it's important for me now. And that's why I stress this genetic stuff to say, stop being the ginger who wants to get tanned. It doesn't happen. Start being the person who adapts to their circumstances, who accepts their circumstances, who adapts to their circumstances and makes the appropriate changes. And if you've got a serious drink or drug problem, you usually need to stop altogether. And so that's the next day, abstinence. And some people find that difficult to swallow, but basically that's what most people have to do. And the genetics is really powerful because you can't run, you can't hide from your genes. It's there. I mean, I could blonde my hair, or I could make it go really dark. I could do the Grecian 2000 on my hair or something. But that's not going to stop me from getting sunburned, is it? I can pretend I'm not a ginger, but it's not going to change. So all the pretending doesn't matter because I have red-haired, DNA in every cell in my body, even though I'm old now and it's faded and you can't even tell it was red. Okay, but I've still got it there. And so if you've got the alcoholic or addict genetics, well then you've got them and you've got them for good and all. And if you've already manifested it now, if you started anew, if you'd been a clean skin and even hadn't had a drink or a drug or whatever, and you started now without the history, you'd still have a good chance of getting it. So we've gone from the reward pathway to genetics, and we've established in genetics that there does actually appear to be something physically different in a good proportion of alcoholics. In the next session, we're going to talk about evolution and the way in which an evolving brain with parts still left in our brain from reptiles and from mammals and from primates, and how they're all talking to one another in a cacophony, how that can conspire to make alcoholism and addiction continue. Thank you.